They thought she was just a kid, barely 17, alone, and out of place in a courtroom full of seasoned lawyers. But when the judge mocked her, and the defense tried to bury the truth, she did something no one expected. And what happened next turned the entire justice system on its head. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. Under the high echoing ceiling of the Fulton County Courthouse in downtown Atlanta, a storm was silently brewing. A sea of murmuring voices filled the packed courtroom. Reporters fumbled with notepads, court officials exchanged confused glances, and a few onlookers stifled laughter. At the center of it all stood a young black girl, barely 5 feet tall, 17 years old in a navy blazer, slightly too big for her slim frame, facing the bench with a calmness that bordered on eerie. Her name was Imani Daniels. To most of the room, she was a curiosity, at best, a joke at worst. A teenager who had the audacity to walk into a courtroom, stand before a seasoned Superior Court judge, and declare, "Your Honor, I will be representing the plaintiff." The judge leaned forward. His name was Wallace Keaton, 63, white, and infamous for his disdain towards self-represented litigants. He had a legacy of biting sarcasm and had once told a public defender to stop wasting the court's time with feelings. Now he looked at Imani over the rim of his glasses, his expression folding into a mask of disbelief. "Is this a mock trial?" he asked dryly. "Because if it is, I'd like to see the cameras and cue cards." The courtroom chuckled, but Imani didn't flinch. "I assure you, Your Honor, this is no mock trial," she replied, her voice steady, clear, and unnervingly composed. "My client, Ms. Carla Jenkins, has been wrongfully threatened with eviction. I intend to prove as much." Keaton blinked, then leaned back in his chair. "You intend to prove it? In this court, with no supervising attorney." "No attorney needed, Your Honor," she said. "Just the truth and the law." Another ripple of whispers swept the crowd. Someone in the back laughed outright. A bailiff smirked. Even Carla, the single mother seated behind Imani, looked unsure now, torn between desperation and disbelief. A few seats away, the landlord's attorney, a balding man named Maurice Reed, snorted. "Young Lady Keaton," said, voice laced with scorn, "this is not a debate club. This is a courtroom. People don't come here to play. Pretend I understand that, Your Honor." Imani said, "That's why I'm here." It was infuriating, her tone, her lack of panic, her refusal to be rattled. Most adults would have cracked under Keaton's stare, but not Imani. There was something unnerving in her stillness, like she had already seen this exact moment unfold and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. The judge wasn't done. "Do you have any formal legal training?" "I do." "Really?" "At 17. "Yes, sir." He leaned forward again, narrowing his eyes. "Then tell me. Miss Daniels, are you aware that practicing law without a license is a criminal offense? In this state, I am." She reached into her briefcase and placed a sealed envelope on the table before her. "I anticipated you'd ask that." "My credentials are inside." Keaton motioned to the bailiff, who carried the envelope to the bench. The judge opened it, and for the first time, His face changed, not to anger, not to amusement, but to confusion. He read the papers slowly. Then again, his hand trembled ever so slightly as he set them down. A long silence followed. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. No one dared speak. Is this authentic? Keaton asked, mostly to himself. Yes, Your Honor, she replied. I passed the bar through Georgia's Juvenile Exemption Clause Article 19B. My file is on record with the state's Bar Association. You can verify that with the clerk of court. The clerk did. And when the answer came back, a quiet, stunned, it's real. The entire courtroom shifted. The smirks vanished. The whispers stopped. Reed, the opposing attorney, suddenly looked like he was sitting on a live grenade. Even Carla's mouth hung open, her doubt swallowed by shock. Imani Daniels, the teenager in the oversized blazer, was a licensed attorney, not a law student, not an intern, a bar-certified lawyer, barely old enough to vote. But it wasn't just her age that unsettled the room. It was the fact that she'd walked in here knowing exactly what they'd assume about her. A black girl, a child, a fluke. She'd been underestimated the second she entered the building. And she had used that to her advantage, quietly, precisely, with surgical confidence. Imani stepped forward again, placing a thick folder on the desk. With your permission. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to begin with a review of the lease agreement and outline the unlawful breach made by the defendant. Judge Keaton, for the first time in years, didn't have a response. He simply nodded. And just like that, the trial began, not with fanfare, not with a bang, but with a 17-year-old girl daring to speak where she wasn't expected to, and with an entire courtroom finally realizing they had never been in control of the story to begin with. The headlines the next day read like something torn from fiction. Teen legal prodigy shocks. Georgia court. 17-year-old black attorney defies odds in Fulton County. Social media exploded. News anchors marveled. Radio hosts debated. But behind all the noise and celebration, in the quiet corners of her grandmother's small Decatur home, Imani Daniels sat alone, her fingers tracing the edges of her worn notebook, not basking in the glory, but reflecting on the long, invisible path that had brought her here. Before the courtroom gasps and viral headlines, there had been only long nights and silent resolve. Imani's brilliance didn't appear overnight. It was forged in the shadows of a world that rarely made space for black girls like her to thrive, let alone lead. While other children played on swing sets or lost themselves in cartoons, Imani had spent hours nestled between stacks of legal encyclopedias in the back corner of the community library, her nose deep in state codes and federal rulings. It wasn't just fascination. It was survival. Raised by her grandmother, Margaret Daniels, a retired school teacher with a steel spine and a heart the size of Georgia Imani, had learned early that life wasn't fair. Her mother had disappeared from her life before she was old enough to remember. Her father was a ghost, the kind who sent birthday cards from halfway houses, always with the wrong date. But her grandmother had been the constant, the anchor, the whisper of hope in every storm. It was Margaret who first noticed Imani's gift, not just for remembering facts or scoring high on tests, but for reasoning, for arguing, for understanding people. At just 9 years old, Imani had successfully challenged a school policy that unfairly penalized students for missing class due to caretaking responsibilities, something she herself had struggled with while helping her ailing grandmother. By 11, she was tutoring college students in constitutional law online under a pseudonym. At 13, she quietly began auditing lectures at Emory University, slipping into the back of lecture halls unnoticed. But brilliance alone doesn't break barriers, especially not when it comes in the form of a black teenage girl from a zip code dismissed by most of the city. So Imani stayed in the shadows, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood the world wasn't ready. Not yet. Her decision to pursue legal accreditation wasn't a declaration of ambition. It was an act of necessity. It had started when she met Carla Jenkins at a community center food drive, watching the woman juggle two toddlers on her hip while quietly sobbing into her hands. Imani didn't ask what was wrong. She listened, and when she heard about the eviction notice delivered under false pretenses, following months of harassment, something inside her snapped. She recognized the pattern. She'd seen it in the stories of her neighbors, her classmates. Even her grandmother's legal language was being weaponized against those who couldn't understand it. And she realized that waiting for the system to care wasn't an option. So she decided to become the system. Her grandmother had been terrified. "You'll be a target," she warned. "They won't see you as brilliant. They'll see you as arrogant, as dangerous." "I know," Imani said, "but someone has to try." She applied for Georgia's rare juvenile exemption clause, compiling an application so airtight it stunned the state board. Her bar exam scores shattered records. Her essays were cited as models, but the committee still hesitated. It wasn't until a retired judge who had once witnessed Imani debate ethics in a university panel offered his personal endorsement that she was granted the license. Even then, she told no one, not because she was afraid of failure, but because she knew her moment had to be earned, not handed. She didn't want to be celebrated for novelty. She wanted to be respected for merit. And that moment came when Carla's court date was pushed up, her legal aid withdrawn at the last minute. With no attorney and no options, Carla turned to Imani in desperation. Imani didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, walked into that courtroom, and let the world see what it had tried so hard to ignore. Now, sitting at the kitchen table in the dim light of early morning, Imani stared at the growing pile of letters, emails, and news requests that had flooded in overnight. Law schools offered scholarships. Activists offered speaking opportunities. Some skeptics tried to poke holes in her credentials, claiming it must be a stunt, a hoax. She didn't care. She wasn't here for headlines. She was here for change. Her grandmother entered quietly, placing a hand on Imani's shoulder. "You scared that judge yesterday," she said, with a chuckle. "Serves him right." Imani smiled, but her eyes remained fixed on her notes. He wasn't the only one. Margaret nodded, then sat beside her. "You're shaking things, baby. You ready for what comes next?" "No," Imani whispered. "But I'm going anyway. Because brilliance like hers was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to illuminate, to disrupt, to reimagine what justice could look like when delivered by someone who understood what it felt like to live without it." She reached for her binder, her hand steady. The courtroom had seen the beginning. But the real work, the real war, was just getting started. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Outside, the world was already humming. Reporters clustered on the steps. Murmurs buzzed through the corridors, and camera crews waited for a glimpse of the girl everyone was suddenly talking about. But inside the courtroom, it was a different kind of quiet. Tense. Waiting. Imani. Daniel stood by the plaintiff's table, her navy blazer pressed and her notes neatly stacked before her. She wasn't dressed to impress. She was dressed to be taken seriously. Yet even now, the eyes of the courtroom followed her, not with respect, but with disbelief. She could feel it in every glance, every whispered comment behind cupped hands. Some were amused, some confused, some outright hostile, but none of it fazed her. At the defense table, Gerald Turner, attorney for the landlord, sat with the kind of smug confidence that came from years of being unchallenged. He wore the faintest of smirks, watching Imani like one watches a child pretending to play dress-up. Next to him sat Roland Marks, the landlord himself, a large man in a gray suit who barely concealed his contempt. Judge Hallstrom entered promptly at 9:00 a.m., his robes flowing and his face stern. He was a man known for his no-nonsense approach, respected, but feared especially by young lawyers still learning the ropes. When he saw Imani at the table, a flash of confusion crossed his features. "Miss Daniels," he said, slowly adjusting his glasses. "Are you here to observe no, Your Honor?" Imani replied, standing straight. "I'm here to represent the plaintiff, Ms. Carla Jenkins." A murmur spread like wildfire through the gallery. Hallstrom blinked. "You're the legal counsel." "Yes, Your Honor." "Licensed under Georgia's juvenile exemption clause. Bar number available upon request." Turner couldn't help himself. He chuckled audibly, leaning toward the judge. "Your Honor, surely this is a misunderstanding. This girl cannot seriously be expected to litigate a civil case in this court." Judge Hallstrom gave Imani a long look, then sighed. "If her credentials check out, and I assume they will given the bar's recent confirmation, then she has every legal right to proceed." Still, the skepticism hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Imani knew this room wasn't just questioning her case. It was questioning her right to be in it. She opened her case with clarity and purpose. No theatrics, just facts. She laid out the timeline, the falsified lease violation, the threats of eviction, the landlord's refusal to accept rent in order to manufacture a breach. She cited municipal housing codes, referenced tenant protection statutes, and cross-referenced clauses in the lease that contradicted the landlord's claims. It was by every legal standard a clean case. But Turner leaned back in his chair, unconcerned. When it was his turn, he rose with a practiced ease and turned to the jury with all the charm of a man used to winning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here today because someone wants a free ride. A tenant who violated the lease and is now using theatrics and a prodigy in training to dodge the consequences." He looked pointedly at Imani as he said it, then smiled as if expecting applause. Imani didn't flinch, but inside, a fire sparked. It wasn't about her pride. It was about Carla, about the two kids who hadn't had a safe night's sleep in weeks, about the truth that Turner had no interest in facing. When Carla took the stand, her voice trembled. She described the late-night notices, the intimidation, the unexpected inspections, and the refusal to accept payments. She brought receipts literal and figurative. Still, Turner tried to trip her up. He leaned on language. Twisted timelines played the role of the doubter. But then Imani rose for redirect Ms. Jenkins. She said gently, "Did you ever receive notice of how many people the lease allowed in your apartment?" Yes, Carla replied. 2 adults, 3 children. And how many people lived there? Just me and my 2 boys. Imani turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit C, text messages from the defendant requesting additional documentation for a supposed 4th occupant that never existed, including demands for payment to resolve the issue privately. She handed the judge a packet of evidence. The courtroom stilled. Turner didn't smile this time. Throughout the day, Imani called witnesses, neighbors, a building inspector, and even a former maintenance worker who testified to being asked by the landlord to find reasons to evict the tenants on the 3rd floor. Every piece was building, layer by layer. She was constructing not just a legal case, but a moral one. It wasn't about law in the abstract. It was about power and those who used it to silence the vulnerable. As the hours passed, even the judge's expression began to shift. His early doubt gave way to thoughtful listening. The jury leaned in. And though Turner kept trying to redirect the weight of Imani's preparation, precision and poise made it impossible to ignore what was happening. By the end of the day, when Imani stood to deliver her preliminary closing, the courtroom no longer saw a teenage girl. They saw a force, a mind sharpened not by privilege or position, but by necessity, and a heart anchored in justice, not performance. I know I don't look like what you expect. She began quietly. But justice doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't come with age or salary, or a name on a door. It comes with courage and truth, and the willingness to speak when silence is easier. She paused. This case isn't just about one landlord. It's about every person who's been told they're powerless. It's about making sure the law works for them, not just those who can afford the best lawyers. The room was silent. When court adjourned, no one moved at first. Then slowly applause broke out. Not from everyone, but enough to echo through the walls. Judge Hallstrom tapped his gavel once, then twice order. He said, but he didn't hide the hint of something in his voice, pride maybe or awe. Imani turned, gathered her papers, and walked out with Carla at her side. The courtroom had awakened, and the world outside was just beginning to listen. The morning after Imani's powerful closing had shaken the courtroom, the world outside moved fast. News had already begun to circulate, not mainstream headlines yet, but local blogs and community radio stations had picked up the story of a teenage legal prodigy who had taken on a seasoned landlord and his high-profile attorney. In certain corners of Atlanta, people were whispering her name with a blend of disbelief and pride. But inside the courthouse, the defense was regrouping. Gerald Turner wasn't used to being on the defensive. His usual tactics undermining credibility, exploiting legal gray areas, twisting perception, weren't sticking the way they usually did. Worse, Judge Hallstrom was starting to see through him. That was when Turner made a move no one expected. It came as a motion, delivered mid-morning, stamped urgent. Turner had new evidence. A manila envelope, thick and neatly labeled, was passed to the court. Inside were photocopied bank statements, tenant records, and what appeared to be surveillance photos. His voice oozed with restrained satisfaction as he announced to the court that these materials proved Miss Jenkins had been subletting her apartment, illegally receiving unreported income, and violating the lease in ways that completely invalidated her complaint. The timing couldn't have been more calculated. Imani remained still as Turner laid it out. She listened, eyes, steady hands folded, but inside her pulse surged. The photo showed different people entering and leaving Carla's apartment at various times, enough to look suspicious if you didn't know what you were looking at. The statement suggested extra income, but none of it made sense. The courtroom murmured with renewed curiosity. Turner smirked. "We believe the plaintiff has committed fraud against her landlord, and this court," he declared, dramatically placing emphasis on each word as if casting a spell. "We move to dismiss the case in light of this deception." Judge Hallstrom raised an eyebrow and turned to Imani Miss Daniels. "Do you wish to respond?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said calmly. "I request a 24-hour recess to review this evidence thoroughly and prepare a response." The judge granted it. "But come prepared, Miss Daniels," he warned. "If this evidence holds, it could change everything." Outside the courtroom, Imani felt the weight settle hard on her shoulders. Carla was shaken. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I haven't been subletting. I don't even know half the people in those photos. What are they talking about?" Imani took a breath. "They're trying to make you look like the villain. They know they're losing. So they're manufacturing doubt, but how I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out." That night, she sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor. Papers spread around her like a storm. She stared at the bank statements, cross-referenced every payment. Some were real. Carla had been helping out a friend who sent a little money in return for childcare. But the others, the names didn't match. The routing numbers traced back to a shell company listed as Falcon Property Services, and something about that felt familiar. Imani called the only person she trusted with cyber forensics. Miles, a college sophomore she'd met at a legal youth summit the year before. He was eccentric, brilliant, and live for challenges. "I need you to trace these accounts," she said, forwarding him scans of the documents. "And fast. If I'm right, they're laundering fake payments through a dummy company." "On it," he said, without hesitation. "You'll have what you need by morning." The next day, when Imani returned to court, she was calm again, focused. The chaos from the day before hadn't shaken her. It had only sharpened her resolve. Turner was confident. He stood with his usual flair, ready to finish what he believed would be the final blow. But he didn't know what Imani now carried in her file. When Judge Hallstrom asked for her response, she stepped forward. "Your Honor, we've reviewed the evidence submitted by the defense," she began, "and we have strong reason to believe that this evidence is not just misleading, it's fabricated." Gasps echoed. Turner's face stiffened. Imani didn't flinch. She laid out her findings. Falcon Property Services was a shell company incorporated 6 months prior, with no employees, no office, and no public listing, except as a property management consultant registered under a different name, Roland Marks, the landlord himself. This company appears to have been created for one purpose. She said, her voice unwavering, to falsify financial records and smear the reputation of tenants. She continued presenting Miles's findings, metadata, showing that the statements were generated from template software transaction logs that didn't match up with official banking protocols, and a timeline that proved the entire trail was planted after the case was filed. Then came the photographs. These images were taken without consent and presented as proof of illegal activity. Imani said, "But we've interviewed several of the individuals pictured. One is Carla's cousin. One is a delivery driver. One was a social worker visiting the building. None of them stayed at the apartment." She paused and let her final point sink in. "The defense has attempted to weaponize suspicion, to distract from the facts to smear a single mother's reputation in order to preserve a system of silence and intimidation, Judge Hallstrom looked down at the files for a long time, then up at Turner. "Mr. Turner," he said slowly, "do you have a rebuttal to any of this?" Turner stood frozen, his mouth a tight line. We were operating under the belief that the documents were accurate." "Your Honor, if there's been a misunderstanding," Hallstrom cut him off, "what there's been. Mr. Turner is an attempt to pervert this court with falsified evidence. I'll be referring this matter to the Bar Association for review." The courtroom erupted again, this time in stunned silence. Turner sat, his confidence shattered. Imani turned to Carla, who had tears in her eyes. This time, they weren't from fear, but from relief. The trap had unraveled, and for the first time, the fight felt winnable. The courthouse on the final day was quieter than usual, yet something in the air hummed with anticipation. No reporters shouting questions, no whispered chatter from the gallery, just a collective holding of breath, as if the very walls of the Fulton County Courthouse understood the weight of what was about to be decided. Imani Daniels sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her expression calm but alert. She had fought every inch of this battle with nothing but her mind, her belief in justice, and a steel-willed refusal to shrink when power loomed. Beside her, Carla Jenkins gripped the edge of the table with trembling hands, but she didn't look afraid anymore, just tired and ready for whatever came next. Across the room, Gerald Turner's posture was no longer cocky. He sat rigid, his lips a thin line, his confidence bruised and rattled by days of unraveling lies. His client Roland Marks was notably absent. Officially, he had taken medical leave from public engagements. But word around the court was that the DA had opened a separate inquiry into fraudulent business practices based on Imani's evidence. At precisely 10 a.m., Judge Hallstrom entered and took his seat. The gavel tapped once, but it didn't need to. The room was already silent. "This court," he began voice, "even and low has reviewed all presented materials, testimony and responses concerning the case of Jenkins versus Marks Properties. The defense's most recent filings have been found to contain inconsistencies, and the plaintiff's counsel has presented compelling evidence of fabrication." He looked up, gaze steady on Imani Miss Daniels. "Your conduct before this court has been extraordinary." The compliment startled even the court reporter. Judge Hallstrom turned back to his ruling. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Carla Jenkins. The eviction notice is hereby declared void. Furthermore, this court recommends the referral of Roland Marks to the district attorney for investigation. Additionally, due to the submission of falsified documents, this court is referring Mr. Turner's actions to the Georgia Bar for ethical review." A gasp rippled through the room. Carla broke into a soft sob, her shoulders trembling with relief. Imani's jaw tightened as she took a deep breath, the moment sinking in, not as a victory lap, but as justice restored. The courtroom soon emptied, but the buzz outside was electric. Reporters swarmed the steps, news vans lined the streets, and camera flashes burst like lightning. But it wasn't just because of the win. It was who had won it. Imani didn't take the podium. She didn't need to. Carla did. With Imani standing beside her, Carla addressed the crowd. "For weeks, I was afraid that speaking up would cost me everything. But this young woman, this brilliant young woman, believed in me when no one else did. She didn't just fight for me. She fought for every single mother, every working-class tenant, Every person who's ever been told their truth doesn't matter. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. We won today. But more than that, we were heard. That night, Imani sat with her grandmother on their porch in the old Fourth Ward. The air was thick with Atlanta heat, but the stars above were clear and sharp, the kind of sky that made you think about the future. Are you proud of yourself? Her grandmother asked softly, handing her a glass of iced tea. Imani looked out at the night. I am. But I'm also aware that this is just one story, one case. Her grandmother smiled. That's how all change starts. Imani had received a dozen emails already. Requests for help, offers from legal foundations. One message came from a congresswoman's office asking her to speak at a youth justice summit in D.C. Another was from a documentary filmmaker. And then there were the messages from strangers, people she'd never met, sharing their own stories of eviction, of being silenced, of being underestimated. She'd become a symbol. But that wasn't what she wanted. She just wanted to keep doing the work. 2 weeks later, she launched something small but ambitious, a community legal initiative led by volunteer attorneys and law students who'd heard about her story and wanted to join the cause. They called it the Daniels Project, though she hadn't picked the name herself. The mission was simple: offer free legal guidance to tenants, especially those in gentrifying neighborhoods under threat of exploitation. Carla was the first to volunteer. The first workshop, held in a borrowed classroom at Spelman College, was standing room only. And when Imani walked up to the whiteboard to begin, she hesitated for just a second, feeling the eyes of so many who believed in her. But she didn't flinch. She picked up the marker and started writing. This is how we fight, she said, her voice steady, with knowledge, with truth, with each other. And in that moment, Imani Daniels didn't just reclaim a courtroom. She claimed her voice, and it echoed far beyond those four walls. Imani Daniels' journey began not with applause, but with ridicule. She was dismissed, belittled, mocked for her youth and the color of her skin by a judge no less, in a courtroom built to uphold justice. Yet from the moment she stood up in defense of Carla Jenkins, a single mother being unjustly evicted, Imani made it clear she wasn't there to play a role. She came to change the rules. What followed was a battle unlike anything that courtroom had seen. Imani, still a teenager, not only held her ground, but methodically dismantled the false narrative crafted by an unscrupulous landlord and his overconfident attorney. She exposed forged evidence, traced fraudulent shell companies, and turned the legal system, often a fortress of exclusion, into a stage where truth was finally given a microphone. But what made Imani's story extraordinary wasn't just the stunning legal victory. It was how she used that moment, not for fame, but for fuel. She could have stopped after clearing Carla's name. She could have returned to a quiet life of study, her brilliance tucked safely away. But she didn't. Instead, she listened to the dozens of voices reaching out to her tenants on the edge of eviction. Young people told they were too young to understand the law, strangers inspired by her strength, but unsure how to find their own. That's when Imani built something bigger. The Daniels Project became a haven for truth seekers, people failed by traditional institutions, now finding guidance, knowledge, and power through community-driven legal support. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real, and it was growing. So what do we take from her story? First, never let someone else's perception define your ability. Imani was underestimated at every turn by a judge, by a seasoned attorney, by an entire system. But the moment she stopped asking for validation and started standing in her own truth, the tide shifted. Second, knowledge. is power, but only if we share it. Imani didn't keep her legal expertise locked away. She used it as a bridge to uplift others. Whether it was breaking down laws for everyday people or mentoring future advocates, she proved that empowerment is most meaningful when it's collective. Third change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks into a courtroom wearing a plain blazer and speaks in a calm, unwavering voice. Sometimes it's a teenager refusing to be silenced. And sometimes it's you choosing to speak up, support someone in need, or stand firm when you're told to sit down. In a world that often dismisses the young, the unheard, the marginalized, Imani's journey is a blueprint for courage. It's a reminder that justice isn't about age status or appearance. It's about truth, resilience, and the unshakable belief that right matters. So now we turn to you. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, made you reflect, or reminded you that there's more to fight for, don't let it end here. Help us keep sharing stories that challenge injustice and elevate voices that deserve to be heard. Subscribe to this channel to support the creators who are bringing real powerful narratives to light. Your support fuels future episodes, deeper investigations, and the amplification of voices, like Imani's voices that remind us we are all part of the change. Don't scroll past. Join the movement. Share the truth and hit subscribe, because stories like this don't just deserve to be told, they deserve to be remembered.